The morning light cast a pale gold sheen across the winding road that snaked through the outskirts of Henderson County, North Carolina. It was the kind of summer morning that clung to your skin heavy with moisture and filled with the buzzing of insects waking with the sun. Amelia Graham pulled into the gravel lot of a weathered roadside diner named Larkspur's. The white paint on the siding had begun to peel. A crooked sign hung above the entrance, swaying slightly in the humid breeze. She shut off her engine and sat for a moment with her fingers clenched around the steering wheel. Her eyes scanned the horizon. A mist hovered over the distant hills. There was nothing visibly wrong yet. Her stomach felt tight, as if something was just out of place. Amelia had always trusted her instincts. That was what made her good. At 28, she had already made a name for herself in Charleston for exposing corruption in a pharmaceutical company and digging into illegal land grabs in rural counties. But this story was different. This story scared her, not just because of the people involved, but because of how close she had gotten. Too close. She stepped out of the car and locked the door behind her. Her satchel, worn from years of field work, hung at her side, heavy with notebooks and microcassette tapes. Inside the diner, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried eggs. A rotating fan squeaked in the corner, moving humid air from one side of the room to the other. A middle-aged waitress with dyed red hair and a faded apron nodded toward an open booth near the window. Amelia took the seat and pulled out a napkin from the dispenser. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag and retrieved a pen. She wrote down a number she had memorized last night. It belonged to a man who said he used to be part of the Ash Grove Circle. Then she wrote 3 more words beneath it. The letters were cramped, as if she were afraid of the ink betraying her intention. She slid the napkin under her coffee cup and waited. The waitress returned with a weak smile and a pot of coffee. Amelia nodded silently, grateful for the quiet. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled past. A bird startled and flew from the telephone wire. Amelia's eyes followed the bird until it disappeared over the treetops. "What am I doing here?" she thought. It had been 4 months since she first heard about the Ash Grove Circle, a so-called spiritual commune tucked deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Officially, it no longer existed. The last mention of it was in a 1992 county record involving a land dispute. Before that, there had been whispers in the late 70s about rituals and missing people, but nothing concrete. That was the problem. Too many whispers, too little fact. Amelia wanted truth. She needed something she could touch. A voice, a name, proof. Last week she had finally gotten it. A man calling himself Jonah had reached out. He said he had once lived among them. He said he had seen things. Amelia drove up from Charleston on a promise that he would meet her in Henderson County. But Jonah had not shown. Her calls had gone unanswered. She should have left then. Instead, she lingered. Her coffee sat untouched. The waitress noticed and returned with concern in her eyes. Amelia gave her a tired smile and asked for directions to a nearby motel. She needed a place to sort through her notes, to sleep maybe, to regroup before heading back. The waitress nodded and jotted something on a receipt. When Amelia left, she did not take the napkin with her. 2 days later, that napkin was discovered by a cleaner tucking a broom under the booth. It had been smudged slightly by the coffee cup, but the words remained legible. The phone number. And the message, "Do not trust Michael." No one saw Amelia leave the diner. A few customers remembered her face, but not her car. One man said she looked like she was waiting for someone. Another said she kept checking the clock on the wall. Her car was found a week later in a wooded ravine off a back road 20 miles north. The doors were locked. Her bag was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints beyond her own. The local sheriff's office filed a missing persons report and passed it on to the state. News spread slowly. Charleston outlets ran her photo with quiet dread. Other journalists speculated. Some whispered about cults. Others accused her of staging her own disappearance. Her editor insisted she would never run. She had just signed a lease. She had a dog she loved. She was building something. But Amelia Graham had vanished. Her parents, Margaret and Thomas Graham, drove up to Henderson County. They sat in that diner booth, touching the napkin as if it might still be warm. Her mother refused to believe she was gone. She clutched every thread, however thin, with shaking fingers. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, paced the small motel room every night, whispering that he should have warned her not all stories were worth chasing. Summer turned to fall. Tips dried up. The trail cooled. Her case became another folder in a cabinet, another face on a corkboard in a sheriff's office. By December, the media had moved on. And yet in that quiet town, a waitress would later tell her daughter that the woman who sat in her booth had eyes like a storm, that she drank no coffee, that she left behind more than she took with her. She left behind questions. She left behind silence. She also left behind that napkin. It would not be until years later that anyone understood what it meant. But even then, the note would remain the first breadcrumb in a trail that would lead to something far darker, far deeper than anyone could imagine. In 1987, Amelia Graham disappeared chasing a story. She would not be seen again for 37 years. And when her voice finally returned, it would come not through words but through footage buried deep in the earth, waiting for the right hands to find it. The mountains rose like silent sentinels in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist that never seemed to lift. Just beyond the ridgeline, in a narrow, forgotten valley, lay the remnants of what had once been known as the Ash Grove Circle. The commune had thrived in the late 1970s, attracting seekers and drifters from across the country with promises of spiritual awakening and communal peace. By the early 90s, it had all but vanished. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, not out of superstition, but from a kind of tired resignation. Everyone had known someone who had gone up there and never really come back the same. Some did not come back at all. Amelia Graham had learned about the Ash Grove Circle through an anonymous letter mailed to her newspaper's office in Charleston. The handwriting was uneven, the language formal, and the return address was fake. But the letter described rituals, disappearances, and a man named Michael Trent, who once held the title of spiritual advisor within the circle. Amelia had folded that letter twice and placed it in her satchel without showing it to anyone. It became the seed of an obsession that would carry her into the heart of those mountains. Using her credentials and her knack for research, Amelia created a new identity. Her alias was Holly Barrett, a teacher from Asheville recovering from divorce and looking for healing in nature. She arrived in the valley one early spring morning and was met by a woman named Elise, who had taken over much of the daily operations of the circle. Elise had soft eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. She welcomed Holly and led her through a modest wooden gate into what remained of the Ash Grove Circle's grounds. There were 6 structures in total, all hand-built and arranged in a crescent around a central fire pit. The group, which had once numbered over 30, now held fewer than 10 members. They farmed a patch of vegetables, foraged in the woods, and kept to themselves. There was no internet, no phones, and the nearest paved road was nearly an hour away by foot. Amelia found herself slipping easily into their rhythm, not because she believed in their teachings, but because she had spent years studying how to blend in anywhere. Her time in the circle was slow and disorienting. Days melted into one another as chores took precedence over conversation, but in the quiet Amelia observed. She noticed the hierarchy. Elise was revered, but everyone deferred to Michael Trent, even though he had not lived among them for years. His name was spoken like scripture. He was the founder, the one who brought the original vision. His teachings, scribbled in leather-bound journals and recited during evening gatherings, were the foundation of their way of life. Amelia filled several notebooks with her observations. She drew diagrams of the cabin layouts, copied symbols carved into the beams of the main lodge, and transcribed entire passages from the teachings. Each night, once she was alone, she recorded whispered voice notes onto a cassette tape hidden in her mattress. She told herself she would leave after a month. Then she stayed for 2, then 3. The day her cover was blown began like any other. Amelia had joined a foraging group heading into the forest to collect mushrooms and bark for tinctures. One of the younger members, a man named Jonah, had taken a particular interest in her since she arrived. He was curious, kind, and far more skeptical than the others. That morning, he walked beside her and asked casual questions about her life before Ash Grove. Her answers were consistent, her tone measured. But something in his expression shifted. His eyes lingered on her face longer than usual. That night, during the communal meal, she noticed him whispering to Elise. The following morning, Amelia's bag was gone. Her satchel, which she always kept beneath her bed, had vanished. Her notebooks, her tape recorder, even her toothbrush. Gone. She confronted Elise, who only smiled and asked if she was feeling unwell. The atmosphere had changed. The others no longer looked her in the eye. Jonah avoided her completely. That evening, Amelia left the fire circle early and climbed the ridge behind the commune. She had hidden a second cassette recorder in a hollow log beneath a boulder near the trailhead. It was her emergency plan, her insurance. But when she reached the log, the recorder was missing. In her final days at Ash Grove, Amelia became paranoid. She slept with a makeshift knife fashioned from a broken tool and kept watch through the night. She no longer participated in chores or meals. Elise approached her only once, gently reminding her that fear had no place among them. Amelia did not reply. On her last night, she packed what little she could find and slipped into the woods under cover of darkness. She did not take the path. She moved through underbrush guided only by moonlight and instinct. By dawn, she had reached a fire road and flagged down a forest ranger. She gave her real name and asked to be taken to the nearest bus station. What the authorities never knew was that Amelia did not go home immediately. She stopped in Henderson County to collect herself to prepare her report to contact a source she had trusted with backup materials. Jonah. She had realized too late that he was not who he claimed to be. That was the reason she wrote his real name on the napkin, not because he had betrayed her by exposing her cover, but because she had discovered his real identity. He was Michael Trent's nephew. He had never left the circle. He had never intended to help her. The Ash Grove Circle, once believed defunct, still existed in shadow. It had adapted, downsized, gone underground. Amelia's infiltration had threatened the delicate secrecy they relied upon. Her escape had not gone unnoticed. In the days following her departure, 3 anonymous phone calls were made to the Henderson County Sheriff's Office reporting sightings of a disoriented woman matching her description walking the woods near the county line. None were ever verified. One call was traced to a payphone outside a truck stop 20 miles south. Another came from a burner cell later discarded in a church parking lot. The third was never traced at all. The cult had found her again. The front porch of the Graham family home in Charleston had not changed in decades. The white railing remained chipped at the corners, and the rocking chairs still creaked against the floorboards when the wind picked up. Margaret Graham sat with a blanket folded across her lap, her fingers wrapped tightly around a mug of cooling tea. Across from her, Thomas Graham sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the azalea bush at the edge of the lawn. He had trimmed that bush every spring since Amelia was a child. The clippers rested untouched on the porch table beside him. It had been weeks since their daughter had disappeared. The silence that now filled their home was a different kind of silence, one that settled deep into the walls and refused to move. Margaret had always been the one to hope. She clung to it even when logic failed her. Every morning she checked the phone line to make sure it had not gone dead. She scanned the mailbox for postcards or letters with smudged return addresses. She refreshed online news alerts for any mention of Henderson County or anything involving a missing journalist. Her kitchen table had transformed into a workspace cluttered with binders, hand-drawn maps, photocopied police reports, and a neatly kept log of her own calls to law enforcement. Thomas, by contrast, had grown quieter with each passing day. He spent hours pacing the driveway or sitting on the porch, never speaking unless asked. When he did speak, his voice seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. The Charleston Police Department had handed the case to the state within the first 2 weeks. The Graham family received a visit from a plain-spoken investigator named Cynthia Monroe, who spoke in careful tones and carried a notebook that never left her hand. Cynthia listened. She took notes. She promised to follow every lead. But Margaret saw the doubt in her eyes. They had no evidence of foul play. No eyewitnesses. Only a parked car discovered near a ravine and a napkin bearing the words, "Do not trust Michael." Margaret tried to tell the detective about the cult, about the stories Amelia had confided in her months before her disappearance. But the more she spoke, the more she realized how it must have sounded. A hidden commune. Rituals. A man named Michael who disappeared from public life only to emerge as an author. It was too much without proof. And Amelia had taken her proof with her. In 1991, almost 4 years after Amelia went missing, a postcard arrived at the Graham residence. The card was unmarked, except for the word buried printed in block letters above a hand-drawn symbol. Margaret recognized the symbol immediately. Amelia had sketched it once on a napkin during dinner, explaining that it was carved into doorframes and books at the commune. It resembled a broken circle with a vertical line cutting through the center. The card had been postmarked from Asheville, only an hour from where Amelia had last been seen. The police sent it to handwriting experts who confirmed that the script likely matched Amelia's known samples. That confirmation gave Margaret a renewed sense of purpose. She believed Amelia was alive. She believed her daughter had sent that card in secret. But she also knew it meant Amelia was still in danger. Over the next several years, Margaret and Thomas made repeated trips to North Carolina. They met with private investigators, amateur search groups, and even a former cult member who claimed to have fled Ash Grove in the late 1980s. His name was Jonas Carter. He met the Grahams in a church basement outside Boone and spoke cautiously, his hands trembling as he sipped from a styrofoam cup. He said Amelia had asked questions no outsider should have asked. He said Michael Trent had once described journalists as parasites, people who distorted truth to feed themselves. He also said the circle believed in cycles of purification. Those who interfered with spiritual progress were often removed. Jonas never confirmed what happened to Amelia, but the fear in his eyes said enough. He passed Margaret a single page torn from a notebook before disappearing back into obscurity. That page contained Amelia's name and the date, June 17th, circled in red ink. The strain of their daughter's absence wore heavily on the Grahams. Thomas began to suffer from insomnia. He stopped taking calls from friends. He spoke less and less, spending his nights listening to police scanner broadcasts and local radio reports. Margaret found solace in church groups and support meetings for families of the missing. Yet, even among those who understood loss, she felt alone. There was no closure, no funeral, no confirmed crime. Only a void where her daughter's voice used to be. Every time she heard footsteps on the porch or the phone rang unexpectedly, her breath caught in her throat. Hope had become a torment. In 1996, a journalist from a regional magazine reached out to Margaret to do a retrospective on Amelia's case. The article featured old family photographs and interviews with former colleagues who remembered Amelia as fearless and driven. The piece reignited public interest briefly. Margaret hoped someone would come forward, someone who knew more. But the story faded again within weeks. People moved on. Investigations lost funding. Leads dried up. The world forgot. But the Graham family did not. By the early 2000s, their home had become a kind of shrine. Amelia's childhood bedroom remained untouched. Her awards still hung on the wall. Her desk was still lined with books and research folders. Margaret continued her quiet investigations, printing new copies of missing person posters each year and mailing them to libraries, post offices, and trailheads throughout western North Carolina. She started a small blog dedicated to the case, chronicling every update, every strange encounter, every dream that hinted at meaning. The comments were few, but she posted regularly as if Amelia might someday read her words. The foreclosure auction had not drawn much of a crowd that morning. A few curious locals stood beneath the overcast sky in front of Harlan's mini storage on the outskirts of Asheville. Most were hoping for tools, camping gear, or maybe vintage furniture. The auctioneer called out the lot numbers with little ceremony, his voice echoing slightly against the row of metal doors. Lot 17 had been unpaid for more than 12 years. The account was registered under a false name and a disconnected phone number. There was no emergency contact. When the lock was cut and the door rolled open, dust billowed out in a thick gray cloud. Inside, a stack of weathered boxes, some half-collapsed, sat beside a trunk and several crates covered in plastic sheeting. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. Then, someone spotted the symbols. Etched into the side of a wooden crate was a circle with a vertical line down the center. Another box bore a hand-drawn map labeled Ash Grove Valley. An off-duty deputy attending the auction contacted the sheriff's office, and within hours the unit was taped off and placed under investigation. Forensic teams arrived that afternoon. Inside the trunk, they discovered handmade robes in faded green and tan, some adorned with hand-stitched patches that resembled birds and branches. Beneath the robes, bundled in plastic wrap, were spiral-bound journals and leather notebooks. One bore initials in the corner. A.G. Investigators opened it carefully, noting the fragile paper and the meticulous handwriting. The first page began with a date. April 3rd, 1987. It was signed Amelia. The journals spanned more than 3 months of daily entries. Amelia had chronicled her days inside the Ash Grove Circle with exacting detail. She recorded names, activities, schedules, and the phrases used in their group rituals. She had drawn crude sketches of the layout of buildings and described a ceremony scheduled for mid-June. She wrote about being watched, about strange whispers outside her room at night, and about a man named Michael who only visited during full moons. One page near the back of the journal was heavily smudged as if erased and rewritten multiple times. The final line read, "If I disappear, Michael knows why." In another box, forensic analysts discovered cassette tapes marked with dates ranging from April to June of 1987. Most were degraded, but several were still intact. On one, Amelia's voice narrated her daily observations. She spoke softly and clearly, describing the group's changing behaviors. She mentioned a ceremony planned for June 17th, the same date noted in her journal and on the note given to her parents by the former cult member. Her voice on the tapes shifted from calm to anxious over time. She expressed concern that someone had been in her belongings. She suspected her false identity had been compromised. In the last recorded entry, she said she planned to leave in 2 days. Her tone was flat and resolved. She ended with a request. "If anyone finds this, tell my family I tried." The storage unit itself offered no immediate explanation for how the items got there. The lease had been opened in August of 1987, 2 months after Amelia vanished. It had been paid annually in cash until 2009. After that, the payments stopped. The name listed on the lease was Hugh Collins, a name with no matching records in the state of North Carolina. Investigators tracked every possible variant of the identity, but all leads led to dead ends. Surveillance footage from the storage site had long since been deleted. The manager who had opened the unit back in 1987 had died years earlier. Without any witnesses or clear chain of custody, the case remained frustratingly opaque. Still, the materials in the unit were a breakthrough. The sheriff's office reopened the cold case and contacted Margaret Graham, now in her early 60s. She traveled to Asheville with her niece to identify the items. Upon seeing the journals, Margaret broke down in the evidence room. She confirmed the handwriting belonged to her daughter. She recognized phrases Amelia had used as a teenager scribbled in the margins. One of the spiral notebooks even contained a shopping list in Amelia's shorthand. To Margaret, these were not just documents. They were proof. Proof that her daughter had been alive long after the world assumed her gone, and proof that she had not vanished by accident. The discovery made headlines. Media outlets picked up the story, calling it a major development in one of North Carolina's most puzzling missing persons cases. Experts on cults were invited onto talk shows. Former members of fringe religious communities offered their theories. The public reaction was a mix of intrigue and sorrow. But for Margaret and Thomas Graham, the attention meant very little. They had one goal: find Amelia, or at least find out what happened to her. As forensic teams continued to analyze the contents of the unit, they found one final item tucked behind a broken filing cabinet. A set of color photographs, slightly faded, wrapped in wax paper. The images were candid, showing people in robes standing in a clearing surrounded by trees. In one photo, a woman stood at the center, her eyes covered with cloth, her hands held at her sides. Her face was partially visible beneath the blindfold. The investigators showed it to Margaret. She stared at it for several minutes without speaking. Then she nodded. "That is my daughter," she said. The storage unit, forgotten for more than a decade, had become a time capsule. It held within it fragments of Amelia's life during the months she spent inside the Ash Grove Circle. The journals, tapes, and photographs painted a portrait of fear, bravery, and determination. They also raised new questions. Who placed the items in storage? Why were they preserved so carefully? And what happened after? Amelia fled the cult. Investigators had more than enough reason to believe she was alive for weeks, possibly months, after her disappearance. But they still had no body, no confirmed sighting, and no witness willing to step forward. The mystery remained. The early spring ground in Henderson County had not yet fully thawed when Carl Hensley began tilling the unused western corner of his property. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, but the sloped field near the tree line had remained untouched for years. Weeds had taken over, and the soil was littered with broken branches and the remnants of old barbed wire fencing. Carl had decided it was time to clear the area and perhaps turn it into a new grazing section for his cattle. His tractor moved steadily through the brush, the tiller grinding through topsoil and roots until it struck something solid. At first he assumed it was another rock, but when he stepped down to investigate, he realized it was not natural. Buried just beneath the surface was a rusted metal box roughly the size of a large shoebox. The edges were corroded, and the metal had discolored with time. Carl knelt beside it, brushing away dirt with his gloved hands until he could lift it free. The box was heavier than he expected. He carried it to his barn and placed it on his workbench. There was no lock, only a tight-fitting lid. When he pried it open, the scent of mold and aged fabric rose into the air. Inside, wrapped in what remained of a canvas tarp, was a small, handheld camcorder. The casing was cracked and warped from exposure to moisture, but the initials AG were faintly scratched onto the side of the box lid in the upper right corner. Carl's wife Janine was the one who connected the initials. She had worked as a secretary at the Henderson County Public Library in the late 1980s and remembered the case of Amelia Graham. She recalled the photo from the missing poster, a young woman with clear eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. She remembered the rumors, the talk of a cult, the abandoned car found near their side of the county. Janine convinced Carl to take the box to the local sheriff's department. He hesitated at first, uncertain whether it was anything more than junk. But something in the way the camcorder had been so deliberately buried made him uneasy. At the sheriff's office, deputies examined the box and documented the discovery. The location of the find placed it approximately 3 miles from the known site of the former Ash Grove Circle compound. That proximity triggered immediate attention. The AG initials, the style of the camcorder, and the storage method all aligned with the timeline of Amelia's disappearance. The sheriff contacted the State Bureau and arranged for the camcorder to be sent to a forensic lab specializing in obsolete media recovery. It would take weeks to determine if any footage had survived, but the possibility alone stirred interest across departments that had long considered the case cold. In the meantime, investigators returned to the Hensley farm. Carl walked them to the spot where he had found the box, pointing to the shallow furrow where the tiller had struck metal. Surveyors scanned the surrounding soil for any other disturbances. They found fragments of canvas and a single plastic button, possibly from a coat or satchel, but nothing else. Soil samples indicated that the box had been buried for at least 20 years, possibly longer. No clear path led to or from the burial site. The surrounding trees had grown thick and wild, obscuring any tracks or signs of activity from previous decades. The location of the box raised difficult questions. If Amelia had buried it herself, why had she chosen this spot so close to the area where she had previously been held? And if someone else had buried it, what were they trying to hide or preserve? The most troubling theory was that the box had been left there not as a time capsule or message, but as a warning. The discovery reignited interest in the case. Journalists returned to Henderson County, and the Graham family issued a statement thanking the Hensleys for their honesty. Margaret Graham declined interviews but privately visited the sheriff's office to view the box. She touched the scratched initials with her fingertips and said only that it looked like her daughter's handwriting. When the forensic team recovered partial footage from the camcorder, it was grainy and unstable. The first 30 seconds were silent, showing static and distorted light. Then the image sharpened. The footage revealed a nighttime gathering lit by fire and surrounded by trees. Figures in robes stood in a semicircle. In the center stood a woman with a blindfold, her posture rigid. Her voice, though faint, was calm and controlled. Amelia spoke briefly about truth, about sacrifice, and about memory. Her words were interrupted by a male voice, deeper and louder, addressing the group. Investigators later analyzed the audio and matched the voice to an interview conducted years ago with Michael Trent, the former cult leader turned self-help speaker. The most haunting moment occurred midway through the tape. As the camera shifted and refocused, a faint voice could be heard whispering behind the camera. The words were unclear at first, but after enhancement analysts identified the phrase, "She knows about the cabin." The tone was childlike, the whisper urgent. The footage ended abruptly, with a crack of static and a loud pop, possibly the result of battery failure or external damage. The State Bureau confirmed the video was authentic and untouched. No evidence of editing or staging could be found. The release of the footage caused a media frenzy. News outlets ran the clip on national broadcasts. Public pressure mounted on Michael Trent to comment. His representatives issued a statement denying any connection, claiming the footage had been fabricated by enemies seeking to destroy his reputation. But his voice was undeniable. Former cult members came forward anonymously describing the ceremonial gatherings and identifying the cabin mentioned in the whisper as a real location used for isolation and disciplinary rituals. They claimed the cabin had been burned down in the early 90s, after several members left the group. The lab in Raleigh had handled decades-old VHS cassettes before, but the camcorder from the Hensley farm presented unique challenges. Water damage had warped part of the casing. The internal battery had corroded, and the tape itself had adhered to the casing in areas. A team of forensic video analysts spent weeks carefully deconstructing the device, transferring the footage frame by frame. They ran tests on the audio adjusting pitch and removing background noise to salvage as much spoken content as possible. What emerged from the restoration process shocked even the most seasoned technicians. The tape was not a home movie. It was a record. It was a moment frozen in time that no one was supposed to see again. The footage began with darkness. For nearly 30 seconds, only rustling could be heard, followed by the soft clicks of a recording button and shifting cloth. The lens slowly adjusted to a dim, flickering light. A bonfire burned in the center of a clearing. Shadows danced across trees and faces. Several individuals stood in a semicircle, all wearing robes made of rough-spun fabric. Their heads were covered by hoods, but a few faces remained partially visible in the flickering firelight. The camera angle remained low and slightly tilted, as if it had been placed discreetly on a log or rock. In the center of the circle stood a woman. Her figure was slim, and her shoulders were squared despite the fact that her eyes were covered by a cloth tied tightly around her head. She wore a plain dress that appeared damp at the edges. Her hands were held loosely at her sides. As the group swayed slowly to the rhythm of a chant that did not fully reach the camera's microphone, the woman began to speak. Her voice was low and steady, not shaking with fear or panic, but measured and deliberate. She talked about memory, about truth being heavier than silence. She said that stories needed to be told, especially when they had been buried. Investigators enhanced the audio and compared voice samples to known recordings. The result was conclusive. The voice belonged to Amelia Graham. Her inflection and cadence matched news segments from the mid-1980s. Even without the facial match, the manner of speech and the phrasing she used confirmed her identity. The woman in the footage was Amelia, recorded in what appeared to be the final days of her disappearance. Her presence in the center of the ritual circle gave the impression of a trial, or perhaps a forced confession. She seemed aware of being watched, but did not acknowledge the camera. Her words carried a tone of finality. The most revealing moment occurred 3 minutes into the video. A male voice interrupted Amelia's speech. He spoke slowly and with authority. The camera picked up only fragments, but enough was clear to identify him. He asked her why she had returned. He accused her of betrayal. He said she had taken something. Analysts isolated the audio and ran a voice-print comparison. The voice matched archival interviews given by Michael Trent in the early 1990s. His presence in the footage, combined with the statements of former cult members, established a strong link between him and the final days of Amelia's known life. Trent had denied any involvement with the Ashgrove Circle since 1989. The footage proved otherwise. Near the end of the video, as the group moved closer to the fire, a faint whisper emerged beneath the chanting. The source of the whisper appeared to be someone near the camera, possibly a child. The voice was soft but carried urgency. It repeated a phrase that, when enhanced, became clear. The whisper said, "She knows about the cabin." That phrase changed the direction of the investigation. The team immediately began searching historical aerial maps, land records, and former cult documents for any references to a cabin. The statement implied not only that Amelia had discovered a secondary location, but that someone else knew it was important. The whispering voice became a point of particular interest. Forensic analysts suggested the voice was too high-pitched and unsteady to belong to an adult. Experts estimated the speaker was a child between the ages of 6 and 10. This detail raised troubling possibilities. If a child had been present during the rituals, it meant the cult involved minors in their inner proceedings, something that had never been confirmed. Investigators pulled all records of missing children from the region between 1985 and 1995. Several names surfaced, but no matches were immediately made. The cabin referenced in the whisper became the focus of a renewed field search in the Blue Ridge area. The sheriff's office released a partial transcript of the video to the media. The public response was swift and emotional. Talk shows debated the ethical responsibility of showing footage from a presumed cult ceremony. Commentators questioned how a man like Michael Trent could have built a new public persona while harboring such a past. Trent himself issued a statement through legal counsel denying any connection to the video. He insisted the footage had been manipulated. He said he had been the target of a smear campaign for years. But as the evidence mounted, his credibility began to unravel. Margaret Graham was given a private viewing of the video at the sheriff's office. She sat in a small conference room with the screen positioned 10 feet away. Her niece sat beside her holding her hand. When Amelia's voice played, Margaret did not cry. She stared at the screen, barely blinking. When the whisper came through the speakers, she leaned forward slightly. After the video ended, she asked for it to be played again. She did not speak for several minutes afterward. Later, she told investigators that the whispering voice had sounded familiar, but she could not immediately place it. The footage from the camcorder became the centerpiece of the reopened investigation. It was more than evidence, it was testimony. It placed Amelia at a location long thought empty. It identified individuals previously assumed to have moved on. It confirmed that what had happened in those mountains was not imagined, and it suggested there was more to find. The cabin mentioned in the whisper represented a potential site of critical importance both to the case and to understanding the full scope of what Amelia had uncovered. The news reached Michael Trent in Los Angeles late on a Monday evening. He had just returned from a promotional event for his latest book and was preparing for a podcast interview when his assistant handed him a phone. On the other end was his publicist, her voice tight with urgency. The video had gone public. A segment had aired on a national cable news network showing blurred visuals of the ritual and clear audio of Amelia Graham speaking. More critically, the unmistakable voice of Michael himself was highlighted by investigators, accompanied by a side-by-side comparison with archival interviews. Within hours, social media erupted. The man who had built a career on personal transformation and emotional healing was now linked to one of the most disturbing missing person cases of the past 4 decades. Michael issued a prepared statement the following morning. It was brief and defensive. He denied ever participating in any cult activities or ceremonies resembling those in the video. He claimed the footage was a manipulation possibly created by former associates with an agenda. He acknowledged having known Amelia Graham in passing, but described her as a journalist who had exaggerated her claims to gain attention. The statement ended with a familiar refrain he had used often in interviews. He said, "Everyone deserves to move beyond the mistakes of their youth." Behind the scenes, however, Michael's legal team scrambled to manage the damage. Journalists began pulling old interviews, reviewing public records, and contacting former residents of the Ash Grove Circle. Several of those former members, now in their late 50s and 60s, began speaking anonymously to reporters. One described a charismatic young leader named Michael, who had organized weekly gatherings and written passages they referred to as the Trenton Doctrine. Another recalled the very ceremony that appeared in the recovered footage, describing it as a turning point in the group's history. According to their account, Amelia had been accused of violating spiritual boundaries. The ceremony was meant to break her resistance. The pressure continued to mount. A major news outlet published a detailed exposé tracing Michael's history from his early days in North Carolina to his rise as a self-help speaker. The article revealed that he had changed his legal name twice and had concealed ties to members of the disbanded commune. When confronted with these findings, Michael sat down for a carefully staged television interview. Wearing a neutral-colored suit in a softly lit studio, he addressed the allegations with a calm demeanor. He reiterated that he had known Amelia briefly and had tried to help her adjust to life in the group. He claimed that he left Ash Grove Circle in the late 1980s due to ideological disagreements and had no involvement in its activities afterward. When asked directly if he was in the video, he paused before saying the footage had been altered. The interviewer pressed him further, but he would not budge. The response from the public was divided. Some of his longtime followers defended him, calling the situation a coordinated attack. Others expressed disappointment and anger, saying they felt betrayed by someone they had trusted. Sales of his books dropped sharply. Several event venues canceled his scheduled appearances. Sponsors pulled support from his podcast and web series. Despite his denials, the weight of the evidence had started to shift public perception. Investigators reviewed additional tapes and writings found in the storage unit and cross-referenced them with information from his published works. Parallels in language and philosophy began to surface, strengthening the theory that his public persona had been carefully constructed from the remnants of his past life. In an unexpected turn, Michael's ex-wife came forward. She had been married to him briefly in the early 1990s, and though she had never spoken publicly about their relationship, she now agreed to an interview. She confirmed that he had spoken often about a woman named Amelia, and had kept journals filled with strange symbols and prayers. She remembered him waking from nightmares shouting about the forest and the fire. Though she had no direct knowledge of what happened at Ash Grove, her account painted a picture of a man haunted by unfinished business. Her comments added emotional depth to the emerging profile of Michael Trent, complicating the narrative but also reinforcing the possibility that his connection to Amelia had been personal and profound. Meanwhile, a local journalist working independently contacted the sheriff's office with a series of recorded conversations from former cult members who had attended a regional support group. These conversations revealed a consistent pattern. The name Amelia had come up multiple times, always in the context of a woman who challenged Michael's authority and refused to submit to the group's hierarchy. One member recalled being told that Amelia had brought danger to them all, and that her removal was necessary for their survival. These statements suggested not only recognition, but a shared understanding of her fate. The investigation expanded to include financial records, travel logs, and phone data related to Michael Trent. While much of the older information had been lost or destroyed, a few records survived. One showed a cash rental of a vehicle near Henderson County in June of 1987. Another indicated a property lease under a pseudonym matching one used in his early speaking engagements. These fragments were not enough for a warrant, but they helped form a clearer timeline and built momentum behind the case. Prosecutors considered reopening charges related to obstruction and potential involvement in a disappearance. Michael's legal team pushed back, citing a lack of physical evidence and the limitations of memory over time. Amid the mounting legal and public pressure, Michael held one final press conference. Surrounded by his attorneys and seated behind a table lined with microphones, he read from a prepared statement. He did not admit guilt. He did not apologize. He spoke about reinvention, about the ways people are forced to change when confronted with who they once were. He said he would be stepping back from public life to reflect. The room was silent when he finished. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out without answering a single question. The search for the cabin referenced in the recovered footage began with topographic maps and handwritten notes found among Amelia Graham's journals. She had drawn rough outlines of trails, elevation shifts, and natural landmarks, most of which investigators assumed were related to her escape route. But after analysts cross-referenced the details with satellite images and historical forestry records, a pattern emerged. One sketched map in particular, marked with a series of dots, and a symbol resembling a triangle, matched an abandoned logging road northwest of the original Ash Grove Circle property. The road had been decommissioned in 1979 and closed off after a landslide made it inaccessible to vehicles. What intrigued search teams was a set of notations in Amelia's handwriting beneath the sketch. The notes read, "Beyond the ridge behind the third stream, east of the bent pine." A search team set out before sunrise with GPS equipment, trail markers, and ground-penetrating radar. The terrain was dense with undergrowth, and the narrow path twisted through steep inclines and overgrown switchbacks. After nearly 4 hours, one of the deputies spotted a weathered structure partially obscured by vines and collapsed branches. The cabin stood on a slight rise at the base of a ridgeline, its wooden frame warped from decades of exposure. The roof sagged in the middle, and several planks had come loose along the porch. Yet, despite its deterioration, the structure was intact. The team called in a forensic crew and established a perimeter. Inside the cabin smelled of rot and stagnant air. Dust clung to every surface. A single cot sat against the back wall, its mattress sunken and stained. Nearby, a small metal stove rested beneath a broken window, and a shelf lined with mason jars had toppled long ago. What drew attention immediately was the wall directly across from the entrance. Symbols had been carved into the wood, some overlapping, others marked with what appeared to be soot or ash. Investigators photographed every inch, cataloging what they believed to be ritualistic inscriptions. Among the markings was a familiar one, the broken circle with a vertical line that had appeared on Amelia's belongings and in the footage. In the far corner of the cabin, beneath a loose floorboard, the forensic team discovered a canvas sack containing several items. The first was a cracked compact mirror, its surface blackened and chipped. The second was a length of cloth tied with a knot at both ends. The third was a notebook with water-damaged pages, many of them unreadable. But a few entries survived. They were brief, written in a rushed script. The entries spoke of watching eyes of voices in the walls of the air feeling heavier each night. One line read, "I am not alone here." Another stated, "They come when I sleep." The final legible note said only, "Do not forget who I am." The items were sent to the lab for analysis, and the handwriting was quickly confirmed to be Amelia's. Based on the deterioration of the materials and the state of the cabin, investigators estimated that the notebook had been left in the early summer of 1987. That timeline aligned with the final entry in her primary journal and the footage recovered from the camcorder. The discovery suggested that Amelia had either been brought to the cabin by force or had fled there on her own. There were no signs of struggle, no traces of blood or human remains, but something about the cabin felt unfinished, like a page torn from a book before the story ended. Deputies searched the surrounding area for additional clues. Less than 50 yards from the cabin, buried beneath a pile of stones, they uncovered a small fire pit. Inside were fragments of burned paper, pieces of metal, and scorched cloth. A partially melted bracelet was identified among the debris. Margaret Graham later confirmed that Amelia had worn a bracelet with a silver clasp during her time at the newspaper. The charred remains were collected and preserved, but no DNA could be extracted due to the fire damage and the passage of time. Still, the discovery added another layer to the unfolding timeline. The area around the cabin revealed more. A narrow path led uphill to a rocky ledge overlooking the valley. From that vantage point, the remains of the Ash Grove Circle compound were visible through the trees. It became clear that the cabin had served as a watchpoint, or perhaps a place of exile. A secondary investigation into regional cult activity revealed similar patterns. Former members described how dissenters, or those deemed spiritually contaminated, were often sent away for isolation. The term used was purification through solitude. Amelia's notes and the physical evidence suggested she had been subjected to this practice. The sheriff's department held a press briefing to announce the discovery. They stated that, while the cabin did not contain definitive evidence of Amelia's fate, it represented a significant location tied to her final known movements. Margaret Graham attended the briefing but did not speak. She held a photo of Amelia printed from a scan of the recovered footage. Behind her, an enlarged aerial photo of the cabin site hung on the wall. The press circled her with questions, but she only looked at the image in silence. The next day, local contractors were brought in to carefully dismantle parts of the cabin for deeper examination. Beneath one of the support beams, they found a glass vial containing what appeared to be a roll of undeveloped film. The film was intact, though brittle. It was sent to a specialized lab for processing. Investigators hoped it might contain more visuals related to the cabin or the group's activities. If it had been hidden so deliberately, they reasoned it must have held importance. The film roll recovered from beneath the cabin beam was placed into a protective case and transported under chain of custody to a forensic imaging lab in Chapel Hill. The technicians who received it had worked on deteriorated negatives before, but this one was especially delicate. Time, temperature fluctuations, and pressure had left the film dry and brittle. Any sudden movement could fracture it into unreadable shards. Over the course of a week, specialists rehydrated the material in a humidity-controlled chamber. Only then did they attempt to unspool it inch by inch using magnifying tools and ultraviolet light to inspect each frame before digital scanning. The film contained 12 exposures, most of them slightly underdeveloped but salvageable. The first 2 frames showed woodland scenery, trees curved toward the sun with shadowed underbrush beneath them. The third was a shot of a narrow path winding uphill partially obscured by brush. The fourth captured the cabin from the outside, partially hidden behind branches, its roof visibly slumped. These early frames seemed to serve as a record of the environment. Investigators speculated that Amelia might have taken these photographs either as documentation or to orient herself if she attempted to leave. The choice to preserve the roll beneath the cabin suggested she feared it might be lost or destroyed. The fifth image shifted focus dramatically. It showed a group of people seated around a long table outdoors, their backs mostly turned to the camera. The table appeared handmade, covered in fabric and scattered with ceramic bowls and candles. Most of the figures wore robes, their hoods pulled up. Only one face was fully visible, turned slightly toward the camera, as if startled by a sound. That face, when enhanced, bore resemblance to Jonah Cross, the young man Amelia had identified in her final journal entries. Investigators believed this might be one of the last photos she had taken in secret, possibly from behind a tree or outcropping. The 6th and 7th frames were both dark, but with faint outlines of figures moving through trees. One showed a torchlight beam slanting upward into a canopy of branches. The other revealed a set of footprints in wet soil illuminated by a weak flashlight. These frames added little narrative, but their composition suggested they were taken in haste. Amelia might have snapped them while attempting to document night movements of group members, possibly following her suspicions about ceremonies being held away from the main site. The 8th frame delivered the most unexpected detail. It captured a close-up image of a hand pressed against a window pane, the fingers splayed wide. The hand appeared small with grime under the nails and a smear of ash across the palm. Behind the glass, a child's face emerged faintly out of focus, but unmistakable. The expression was vacant, the eyes distant. Forensic analysts enhanced the image repeatedly and determined the child to be between 6 and 9 years old. The photo aligned with the whispered voice heard on the camcorder footage. The identity of the child remained unknown, but the expression haunted everyone who viewed it. The final 4 frames returned to outdoor scenes. The 9th showed a series of stone markers arranged in a circle near a clearing. Burned stumps surrounded them, and scorched earth suggested a fire had taken place there. The 10th was a close-up of a carving on one of the stones. It resembled the broken circle symbol, but beneath it were initials and a date. The initials were AG. The date was June 18th. The 11th frame captured a sunrise over the ridgeline, the color palette soft and eerie. The 12th was blurred, possibly taken as the camera slipped or was dropped. Investigators believed this final shot may have occurred during a moment of flight or confrontation. When the photos were shown to Margaret Graham, she stared longest at the image of the child behind the glass. Her face did not change, but her hand tightened around the edge of the table. She asked to keep a printed copy, which the sheriff's department allowed. Margaret took it home and placed it next to the photograph of Amelia as a teenager. There was something about the eyes of the child that stirred a memory she could not place. She asked her niece to help her find old family albums from the early 1980s. No match was found, but Margaret insisted the child looked familiar. She said the photo proved Amelia was not alone. Public reaction to the images was swift. The image of the child, once leaked to the media, sparked national attention. Advocacy groups demanded investigations into the presence of minors at the Ash Grove Circle. A hotline was established for information about missing children from the area during the cult's years of activity. Several calls came in referencing similar sightings or disappearances, but no direct match was identified. The case grew in complexity, expanding beyond the disappearance of a single journalist to include broader questions of abuse and concealment. Michael Trent declined to comment on the photographs. His legal team issued a statement denying knowledge of the cabin or the individuals depicted. Former cult members began to speak more openly in online forums and podcasts emboldened by the new evidence. One woman, who went by the name Rachel, claimed she had once cared for children at a secondary location she believed matched the cabin's description. She said the children were kept separate from adult rituals but were sometimes used to deliver messages or observe ceremonies in silence. Her account supported the theory that the cabin had been more than just a place of exile. It had functioned as a controlled site, possibly for indoctrination or punishment. Forensic analysis of the film roll added credibility to Amelia's narrative. The photos offered a visual timeline that corresponded with her writings and the recovered camcorder footage. They also revealed more about the cult's infrastructure and the use of coded symbols. The discovery of her initials and the date etched into stone suggested she had marked the site intentionally, perhaps as a final message or warning. The investigators believed Amelia knew she might not survive and had attempted to leave a trail in fragments, hoping someone would one day assemble the truth. The letter arrived on a rainy afternoon in early April. It was not marked urgent and bore no return address. The envelope was cream-colored, the kind used for formal invitations, and the handwriting was fluid but aged. It had been sent to the Graham family home in Charleston, where Margaret still lived. She opened it at the kitchen table, the one covered in documents and maps and notes that had not been moved in years. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained legible. The letter began with a name. It was signed by a man who identified himself as Jonah Cross. The name was not unfamiliar. Investigators had linked it to the photographs in the film roll and to mentions in Amelia's journals. He had once been one of Michael Trent's most loyal followers, a young man drawn to the promise of spiritual clarity. In the letter, Jonah confessed that he had carried the truth for too long. He wrote that silence had become a second prison. He said he had watched Amelia suffer and had done nothing. He admitted to helping bury the camcorder and to sealing the film under the cabin floor. He said it was her last request. She had told him someone would come looking, and that the story needed to survive, even if she did not. Jonah described the final days at the Ash Grove Circle with a clarity that left Margaret motionless. He said Amelia had refused to take part in the closing ceremony, that she had demanded to speak with Michael one last time. She had asked to leave. She had offered to disappear without a trace if they let her go. But Michael had refused. He believed her presence corrupted the group's energy. Jonah wrote that Amelia had been taken to the cabin not for punishment, but for erasure. The silence that followed her disappearance was by design. It was meant to protect the mythology. Jonah said he could no longer live with what he had done. The letter was turned over to the sheriff's department and authenticated. Fingerprint analysis confirmed it had been handled by Jonah, whose prints had been found on earlier evidence. The writing style and references matched known samples from his time in the group. With the letter in hand, authorities issued a request for Jonah to come forward. He did not. His current whereabouts remained unknown, but his words filled in the final gaps. Amelia had fought until the end. She had documented what she could. She had left pieces behind not out of fear, but with purpose. 1 week after the letter arrived, Margaret Graham stood on a wooden platform built near the site of the old cabin. The local historical society had approved a commemorative marker, and members of the search team, law enforcement, and community leaders gathered for the ceremony. A small plaque was unveiled bearing Amelia's name and the words, "In pursuit of truth." She never turned away. Margaret spoke for the first time in public since the discovery. Her voice was quiet but steady. She said her daughter had lived a life of questions and courage. She said Amelia had believed stories mattered even when they were dangerous. She thanked those who had not let the story end in silence. In the months that followed, the case of Amelia Graham became the subject of a national documentary. Interviews with former cult members, forensic analysts, and journalists were woven with footage from the recovered camcorder and scanned images from the film roll. The story unfolded slowly without sensationalism, focusing instead on the resilience of one woman who tried to expose what others feared. Viewers wrote letters to the Graham family. Some shared stories of loved ones who had vanished. Others spoke of finding strength in Amelia's words. The documentary was nominated for an award and included in university curricula. It became not just a true crime story, but a testament to perseverance. Michael Trent was never charged. Despite mounting public pressure and ongoing civil investigations, the statute of limitations and the lack of physical evidence shielded him from prosecution. He retreated from public life, entirely selling his properties and vanishing from social platforms. Several of his former associates issued apologies. A few entered therapy or support groups. The Ash Grove Circle's legacy became a cautionary tale in lectures and seminars. Its members were no longer shadows. They had names and stories, and in some cases, guilt that would not fade. Margaret Graham continued to live in the family home. She turned Amelia's old room into a reading space lined with books and copies of her daughter's reports. She spoke occasionally at conferences about missing persons advocacy. She never claimed closure. She said closure was a myth for people who needed neat endings. What she had was presence. She had the sound of Amelia's voice preserved on tape. She had the feel of her daughter's handwriting under her fingers. She had the knowledge that Amelia had not vanished in fear, but stood in defiance. Margaret found peace not in answers, but in the understanding that love could last longer than silence. The investigation into the Ash Grove Circle remained technically open. New witnesses came forward sporadically. Old members shared recollections that helped build a timeline, but the core truth had already surfaced. Amelia had walked into danger with open eyes. She had documented what she saw. She had trusted that someone would listen. Her story had survived because she chose to tell it even when the telling meant losing everything. Years later, a tree was planted near the clearing where the cabin once stood. It was a white oak, chosen for its strength and longevity. Beneath its roots, a metal container was buried, containing copies of Amelia's journals, a still frame from the camcorder, and a letter written by Margaret to future readers. The letter said that truth was not always immediate. It said some stories waited underground until someone was brave enough to dig. It ended with a sentence from Amelia's final journal. Stories are not meant to vanish. They are meant to be heard. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more gripping true mystery narratives. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to Amelia and where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts help keep these stories alive.